Patricia Wilcox's hand trembled as she aimed the garden hose at her prized hydrangeas, but it wasn't the weight of the nozzle causing her to shake. It was rage. Pure, unfiltered rage. Across the street, Martin Chen was washing his RV in his driveway, a clear violation of Oak Ridge Estate's HOA bylaws, Section 4, Article 12. Third time this month, Patricia muttered, squeezing the nozzle so hard her knuckles turned white. As HOA board president for the past 7 years, she transformed this once-average subdivision into what she considered a model community. And she wasn't about to let some retired engineer with a travel hobby undermine her authority. Patricia shut off the water and marched across the street, her kitten-heeled sandals clicking against the pavement with military precision. At 62, she stood barely 5'3", but her presence commanded attention. Her silver blonde bob perfectly coiffed, her linen pants without a single wrinkle. "Martin, we discussed this," she called out, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Recreational vehicles cannot be washed in driveways. It's right there in the covenant you signed." Martin, a gentle-faced man in his 70s, turned and sighed. "Patricia, I'm just rinsing off some dust before my grandkids arrive tomorrow. They'll be back in storage within the hour." "Rules are rules," Patricia replied, pulling out her phone. "I'll have to document this and issue another fine. That's 3 violations this quarter, which means it goes to the full board for review." What Patricia didn't expect was for Martin to laugh. Not a nervous chuckle, but a full, genuine laugh. "You know what? Go ahead. Take all the pictures you want." Martin's usual deference had vanished. "My son-in-law, James, is flying in with my grandkids. He's actually quite interested in how this HOA operates." Patricia's smile remained fixed. "I'm sure he'll appreciate our commitment to property values and community standards." "Oh, I think he will," Martin said, his eyes twinkling. "James heads an FBI unit specializing in financial crimes, embezzlement, fraud, that sort of thing." The phone nearly slipped from Patricia's hand. For 3 years, she'd been redirecting HOA maintenance funds to renovate her own kitchen, backyard, and primary bathroom. Small amounts, carefully hidden in inflated landscaping invoices. Nothing that would raise suspicion from the mostly retired board members who trusted her implicitly. "Well, I hope they have a lovely visit," Patricia managed, backing away. "Perhaps just this once we can overlook the RV. Neighborly exception." Back in her immaculate kitchen, Patricia poured herself a generous glass of Chardonnay, her mind racing. The HOA's financial review was just weeks away. James Chen might just be visiting family, but she couldn't risk it. She needed to clean up the books immediately and find someone else to take the fall if things went south. Her eyes drifted to the framed photo of the HOA board on her wall, settling on Howard Griffith, the treasurer who blindly signed whatever she put in front of him. Yes, Howard would do nicely. Patricia picked up her phone and began composing a concerned email to the board about discrepancies she'd recently discovered in Howard's bookkeeping. By morning, the neighborhood would be buzzing with a different scandal altogether. Patricia woke at 5 a.m. sharp, a full hour before her usual alarm. She barely slept, her mind churning with contingency plans. The emergency board meeting she called for 7:30 a.m. would be her masterpiece of manipulation. She dressed with purpose. Her navy blazer with gold buttons projected authority while her pearl necklace suggested trustworthiness. The perfect outfit for throwing Howard under the bus. When she opened her front door to collect her newspaper, she froze. Martin's driveway across the street wasn't empty as it should have been at this hour. A black SUV with government plates was parked beside his RV, and a tall man in a suit was helping Martin load suitcases. James Chen had arrived early. Patricia ducked back inside, heart hammering against her ribs. She needed to move faster. She brewed her coffee extra strong and reviewed her presentation one last time. The doctored spreadsheets showing Howard's mismanagement of funds, the falsified approval signatures, and the carefully constructed timeline that absolved her of any wrongdoing. By 7:25, the HOA board members were filing into Patricia's meticulously arranged dining room. 5 retirees who trusted her completely, except for Diane Rodriguez, a former corporate attorney who asked too many questions. Patricia had strategically seated Diane farthest from Howard, who looked confused and slightly alarmed. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Patricia began, her voice grave. "I discovered something deeply troubling in our financial records." She was 3 slides into her presentation when the doorbell rang. Patricia faltered mid-sentence. "Excuse me," she said, forcing a smile. "This won't take a moment." She opened the door to find Martin Chen and a younger man with the same thoughtful eyes but a more imposing presence. "Good morning, Patricia," Martin said pleasantly. "Sorry to interrupt, but I saw all the cars and figured the board was meeting. This is my son-in-law, James." James extended his hand. "Patricia Wilcox, I've heard so much about you." Patricia shook his hand weakly. "We're actually in the middle of an emergency meeting." "Perfect timing then," Martin replied. James has some concerns about the special assessment for the new security system. Since he's an expert in such matters, I thought his input might be valuable. Before Patricia could object, Martin had stepped past her into the foyer, James following with a briefcase in hand. "We don't typically allow non-board members at these meetings," Patricia protested. From the dining room, Diane called out, "Actually, our bylaws explicitly permit homeowners to attend any board meeting. I'd be interested in hearing what Mr. Chen has to say about security." Patricia had no choice but to lead them into her dining room, where her presentation about Howard's embezzlement was displayed on the wall screen. She quickly minimized the window, but not before James glanced at it with professional interest. "Please continue what you were discussing," James said, pulling up a chair. "Don't mind me." Howard looked at the screen, then at Patricia with growing alarm. "What financial discrepancies? I've only ever signed what you gave me, Patricia." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Patricia. Her carefully constructed narrative was unraveling before she could even finish spinning it. Worse, she noticed James writing something in a small notebook. "Perhaps," Patricia said, her mouth dry, "we should table the financial discussion for a different time. Let's hear Mr. Chen's thoughts on the security system." James smiled politely. "Actually, before we move on, I'm quite interested in these financial records you've been reviewing. In my line of work, we see patterns in financial management that might not be obvious to everyone. Would you mind sharing what you found?" The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as Patricia's fingers hovered over her laptop keyboard. Her mind raced for plausible excuses, but under James Chen's steady gaze, each potential lie dissolved before it reached her lips. "It's really nothing concrete yet," she finally managed. "Just some irregularities I wanted the board to be aware of." Howard's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Irregularities with my name attached to them? I want to see exactly what you're accusing me of, Patricia." Diane Rodriguez, the former attorney, closed her notebook with a decisive snap. "I think we all should see those files, Patricia. Now." Patricia reluctantly maximized the presentation again, revealing a spreadsheet with certain line items highlighted in red, all with Howard's signature prominently displayed. "These are forgeries," Howard said immediately, his voice trembling with anger. "I never signed approval for a $15,000 landscape enhancement for the north entrance. We discussed $3,000 for new seasonal plantings, nothing more." James Chen leaned forward, his interest clearly professional now. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the laptop. "This is an internal HOA matter," Patricia objected, but the board members were already nodding their approval. Diane stood up. "Patricia, I've had concerns about financial transparency for months. You've been dismissing my requests for original invoices and contractor bids. I think we should allow Mr. Chen to take a look." As James began scrolling through the files, Patricia felt sweat beating at her hairline. She glanced toward the kitchen, calculating the distance to her back door. "Interesting accounting system you've developed," James commented, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "Particularly these duplicate entries for maintenance services. One set paid to official vendors, another to Property Management Solutions," Diane finished, looking over his shoulder. "A company I've never heard of despite being on this board for 3 years." "It's a subcontractor," Patricia said quickly. "They handle specialized maintenance tasks." Martin Chen, who had been quietly observing from the corner, spoke up. "That address listed for Property Management Solutions, isn't that your daughter's apartment in Westlake, Patricia?" 5 pairs of eyes swiveled toward her. Patricia's hand gripped her pearl necklace. "This is absurd. I'm being ambushed in my own home by people with personal vendettas. Martin is clearly upset about being cited for his RV violations and is using his son-in-law to intimidate me." James raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm here on family vacation, Mrs. Wilcox. Officially, I have no jurisdiction or professional interest in your HOA finances. But as a homeowner's son-in-law and a concerned citizen, what I'm seeing raises serious questions. Questions that should be addressed by the full membership," Diane added, already typing on her phone. "I'm calling for an emergency community meeting tonight." "You can't do that without board approval," Patricia snapped. Howard, still staring at the forged signatures, looked up with newfound resolve. "I make a motion to call an emergency meeting of all Oak Ridge Estates homeowners tonight at 7 p.m. in the community center to address financial discrepancies and potential misappropriation of funds." "Seconded," said Diane immediately. "All in favor?" Howard looked around the table. Every hand except Patricia's went up. "Motion carries," Diane announced, already standing. "I'll send the notification email now and post notices at all entrances." Patricia watched her carefully constructed world begin to crumble. She had exactly 9 hours to either flee, destroy evidence, or find a way to turn this disaster around. And she wasn't about to go down without a fight. The board members filed out of Patricia's home, their usual deference replaced by sidelong glances and hushed conversations. Only Martin lingered, examining Patricia's meticulously arranged collection of neighborhood awards and HOA certification plaques. "I never wanted this to happen, Patricia," he said quietly. "I only mentioned James because I was tired of being harassed about my RV." Patricia's composure finally cracked. "Get out of my house," she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "You've ruined everything." Alone at last, she slumped at her dining table, staring at the HOA financial records still displayed on her laptop. The evidence was damning but not yet catastrophic. Most of the truly incriminating documents were stored in a password-protected folder on her personal computer upstairs. If she could dispose of those files and craft a convincing narrative about accounting errors rather than deliberate fraud, she might still salvage her reputation. Patricia was halfway up the stairs when her doorbell rang again. She froze, considered ignoring it, then saw a uniformed figure through the frosted glass panel. Harold Jenkins, Oak Ridge Estate's privately contracted security guard, or as Patricia preferred to call him, the community safety officer. She opened the door with a forced smile. "Harold, what perfect timing. I was just about to call you." Harold, a former mall security supervisor with delusions of police authority, straightened his utility belt. At 58, he compensated for his receding hairline with an aggressively maintained mustache and a tendency to stand uncomfortably close when speaking. "Mrs. Wilcox, I've just received some disturbing calls from board members about financial irregularities," he said, his hand resting on his holstered taser, a weapon Patricia had specifically authorized despite community objections. "As the security officer contracted to protect Oak Ridge Estate's interests, I need to understand the situation." Patricia recognized an opportunity. Harold had always been her most reliable ally, enforcing her petty rules with zealous enthusiasm in exchange for the authority she granted him. "Come in, Harold. We have a serious situation developing," she said, ushering him inside. "The HOA is under attack from within. Board members are being manipulated by outside influences." As she led him to the kitchen, Patricia outlined a completely fabricated conspiracy. Martin Chen's FBI son-in-law was conducting an illegal investigation to help his father-in-law avoid HOA fines. Diane and Howard were colluding to take control of the board. And most importantly, they were planning to eliminate Harold's position once Patricia was removed. They'd already called an unauthorized emergency meeting tonight, she concluded, watching Harold's expression darken. "They'll tell everyone your services are an unnecessary expense." Harold's hand tightened on his taser. "What do you need me to do, Mrs. Wilcox?" Patricia smiled. "First, we need to secure certain documents that could be misinterpreted if they fall into the wrong hands. Then I think Mr. Chen needs to understand that harassing board members has consequences." Harold nodded gravely. "I'll handle Chen. Nobody threatens the security of this community." As Harold left with a sense of misguided purpose, Patricia turned back to her computer. She hadn't planned to escalate matters this dramatically, but desperate times required desperate allies. And Harold, with his inflated sense of authority and unwavering loyalty to her, was exactly the wild card she needed to buy time. She picked up her phone and began composing an email to the entire neighborhood, positioning herself as the victim of a coordinated smear campaign. By the time she was finished, she had crafted a masterpiece of misdirection that cast doubt on everyone but herself. Martin Chen sat on his front porch, enjoying the afternoon sunshine with his grandchildren, 7-year-old twins who were currently engaged in an elaborate chalk art project on his driveway. His RV had been moved to the side, technically still visible but less prominently displayed in a small concession to neighborhood peace. "Grandpa, look, I drew our house in California," the girl called out, pointing proudly to a purple structure with what appeared to be a swimming pool filled with stick figures. Martin was about to comment when a white SUV with Oak Ridge Estate security emblazoned on the side pulled up sharply at the curb. Harold Jenkins stepped out, adjusting his utility belt with deliberate slowness. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the children's colorful chalk drawings as he marched up the walkway. "Mr. Chen," Harold announced in his official voice, "we need to discuss your continued violations of community standards and your harassment of board members." Martin sighed, standing up. "Kids, why don't you go inside and see if your dad has those popsicles ready?" The children looked curiously at Harold's uniform before reluctantly heading inside. Martin waited until the front door closed behind them. "Harold, there's no violation here. The RV is being moved to storage this evening." Harold stepped closer, invading Martin's personal space. "This isn't about the RV anymore. It's about your son-in-law conducting unauthorized investigations and making threats against Mrs. Wilcox." Martin blinked in confusion. "What threats?" "James just attended a board meeting at my request." "Don't play dumb," Harold snapped, his hand resting on his taser. "Mrs. Wilcox has filed an official security report. Your FBI son-in-law has no jurisdiction here, and using federal credentials to intimidate local officials is a serious offense." Inside the house, the front window curtain moved slightly. James Chen stood watching the confrontation, his phone in hand. "Harold," Martin said calmly, "I think you've been misinformed. Why don't we all sit down and discuss?" "Step back from the officer," Harold barked, suddenly unholstering his taser and holding it at his side. "You're interfering with community security operations." Martin's face hardened. "First, you're not an officer, Harold. You're a contracted security guard. Second, you have no authority to threaten residents with weapons on their own property." Harold's face flushed deep red. "I am empowered by the HOA board to maintain order through any necessary means. Your FBI relative doesn't scare me." The front door opened and James stepped out. "Is there a problem here?" he asked quietly. Harold spun toward him, raising the taser. "Stay right there. I know exactly who you are and what you're doing." James remained perfectly still, his hands visible. "Sir, I'm going to suggest you lower your weapon. I'm here on vacation with my family." "Lies," Harold shouted, visibly agitated now. Patricia explained everything. "You're investigating her to help your father-in-law avoid fines. You have no jurisdiction." From inside the house, the twins had appeared at the window, wide-eyed at the scene unfolding on their grandfather's lawn. One of them was holding a phone, apparently recording. "Harold," James said in the same calm voice, "I'm going to reach for my ID very slowly. But before I do, you should know that threatening a federal agent with a weapon, even a taser, is a federal offense regardless of my duty status." Harold's hand trembled slightly, but the taser remained pointed at James. "Don't move. Patricia warned me you'd try to intimidate me with federal talk." James' eyes narrowed slightly. "Patricia told you to confront me with a weapon?" Across the street, neighbors had begun to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Several had phones out, recording the increasingly tense standoff on Martin Chen's front lawn. Patricia was in the middle of deleting incriminating emails when her phone pinged with a neighborhood watch alert. She glanced at the screen and froze. A live video stream showed Harold pointing his taser at someone on Martin Chen's front lawn. The caption read, "Hell with security threatening FBI agent. What's happening on Maple Drive?" "That idiot," Patricia hissed, grabbing her keys. This wasn't what she'd intended at all. Harold was supposed to intimidate Martin, not create a public spectacle that would draw even more attention to her situation. She drove the 3 blocks to Martin's house in less than a minute, tires squealing as she turned the corner. The scene that greeted her was worse than she'd imagined. At least a dozen neighbors with phones out, Harold still brandishing his taser, and James Chen standing calmly on the front step with his hands visible. Patricia parked haphazardly and hurried toward the gathering crowd, fixing her most concerned expression in place. "Harold," she called out, "what on earth is going on here?" Harold didn't take his eyes off James, handling the situation as discussed, Mrs. Wilcox, confronting the threat to our community. Several neighbors turned to stare at Patricia. "As discussed," someone murmured. Patricia's mind raced. "Harold, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I never authorized this kind of confrontation. Please lower your weapon immediately." Harold finally glanced at her, confusion replacing his righteous indignation. "But you said he was threatening the community, that I needed to handle Chen and his FBI son-in-law." "I said no such thing," Patricia replied firmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I simply asked you to increase patrols due to concerns about strangers in the neighborhood. This is completely inappropriate." The betrayal on Harold's face was almost pitiful. "Mrs. Wilcox, you specifically told me to confront Chen and secure documents from his house. You said his son-in-law was conducting an illegal investigation against you." Whispers rippled through the gathered neighbors. Patricia felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. "Harold is clearly experiencing some kind of episode," she announced to the crowd. "As HOA president, I'm immediately suspending him from his security duties. Someone please call the actual police." "Already done," said Diane Rodriguez, emerging from the crowd with her phone in hand. "They're on their way," as is a reporter from the Chronicle who's very interested in our HOA's security protocols and financial management. Before Patricia could respond, James Chen slowly reached into his pocket and withdrew his FBI credentials. "Harold," he said calmly, "I'm going to show you my identification now. After you've seen it, I strongly suggest you put down the taser and step back." Harold's resolve was visibly crumbling as James held up his FBI shield. The taser lowered slightly. "He's really FBI?" Harold asked weakly, looking to Patricia for confirmation. Patricia saw her last ally slipping away. "Harold, don't let them intimidate you. This is our community." But it was too late. Harold lowered the taser completely, his shoulders slumping. "Mrs. Wilcox told me you were impersonating a federal agent," he said to James. "She said you were helping your father-in-law avoid HOA violations and that you were planning to frame her for financial mismanagement." Martin stepped forward. "That's interesting, considering this morning was the first time James even heard about our HOA issues." In the distance, police sirens wailed. Patricia glanced frantically between her car and the growing crowd of neighbors, calculating her options. Running would only confirm her guilt, but staying meant facing increasingly uncomfortable questions. A new voice cut through the murmurs. "Maybe we should continue this discussion at the emergency meeting tonight," said Howard, the treasurer she'd attempted to frame. "I'm particularly interested in hearing more about these documents Mrs. Wilcox wanted secured from Martin's house." The community center buzzed with unprecedented energy. By 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the emergency meeting was scheduled to begin, nearly every chair was filled. Neighbors who normally ignored HOA matters had shown up in force, drawn by the explosive video of Harold confronting an FBI agent that had circulated throughout the afternoon. Patricia sat alone in the front row, maintaining a facade of dignified composure despite the whispers and pointed looks. She'd spent the hours after the police left preparing her defense, a complex narrative casting herself as the victim of misunderstandings and Harold's overzealous interpretation of routine security directives. Harold himself was notably absent, having been issued a trespass warning by the local police and relieved of his security duties pending investigation. His statement to the officers, detailing Patricia's specific instructions to confront Martin and secure documents, had been damning. At exactly 7 p.m., Diane Rodriguez called the meeting to order. As the board's vice president, she had assumed temporary leadership following an emergency executive session, where Patricia had been asked to step aside during the investigation. "Before we address the financial concerns that prompted this meeting," Diane began, "I believe we should address this afternoon's disturbing incident involving our contracted security personnel." Patricia rose immediately. "As the elected president of this association, I should chair this meeting and control the agenda." "Actually," Howard interrupted, holding up a copy of the bylaws. "Section 8 clearly states that any board member under investigation for misconduct shall recuse themselves from chairmanship duties. We voted on this 3 years ago at your insistence, Patricia, if you recall." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Patricia slowly sat back down, her knuckles white against her purse strap. Diane continued, "For those who haven't seen the video or heard what happened, our security contractor, acting on what he claims were explicit instructions from Mrs. Wilcox, confronted Martin Chen and his son-in-law with a taser drawn. Mr. Chen's son-in-law happens to be a federal agent here on family vacation." James Chen stood up from where he sat beside Martin. "I want to clarify that I'm not here in any official capacity. My father-in-law mentioned some HOA issues, and I attended this morning's board meeting out of curiosity. At no point did I present myself as conducting an investigation or threaten anyone." "Then why did Patricia tell Harold you were conducting an illegal investigation?" Someone called out from the back. All eyes turned to Patricia, who had prepared for this moment. She stood smoothing her linen pants with practiced composure. "There has clearly been a series of misunderstandings," she began, her voice steady. "This morning we discovered concerning financial irregularities that require investigation. I mentioned this to Harold during a routine security briefing, expressing concern about community records. Harold, who has always been overly enthusiastic in his duties, apparently misinterpreted my concerns." Martin Chen stood up. "That's not consistent with what Harold told the police, Patricia. He specifically said you told him I was being manipulated by my FBI son-in-law to avoid fines, and that you needed him to secure documents for my house." "Absurd," Patricia scoffed. "Why would I want documents from your house? All HOA records are stored digitally and in my home office." From the side entrance, a latecomer slipped in. Carol Weber, Patricia's neighbor and closest ally on the street. She hurried to Patricia's side, whispering urgently in her ear. Patricia's composed expression faltered for the first time. "What do you mean they executed a search warrant?" she hissed, not quite quietly enough. The room fell silent as Diane stepped forward. "Would you like to share with the group, Patricia?" Patricia straightened, her mind racing. "There's nothing to share. Now, if we could return to the actual financial matters." "I think that is the financial matter," Howard interrupted, holding up his phone. "I just received a text from Detective Ramirez. Apparently, they found quite a collection of original HOA invoices in your home safe, along with records for a shell company called Property Management Solutions registered to your daughter's address."